Hello, welcome to this video here where I'm going to be discussing, as you could probably see in the title, the topic of trustworthiness. And I'm going to be discussing this within the framework of theories of ethics and how I kind of view that subject, that topic. So just to kind of get into it, there are a few important questions that ethics tends to try to answer. One of them is, what is good? What is bad? What is evil? What is virtuous? And another one, and this is more meta-ethical, is why is good good and why is bad bad? And should you even follow what's good? Should you even not do what's bad? And what even do you mean by that? These are some of the foundational questions when it comes to ethics. And this is something that people have wondered and asked about for thousands of years. I mean, you go back all the way to Aristotle. You go back far and far, and you'll find people foundationally always asking questions of ethics. But people tend to have very different answers, and it's especially, ethics have become especially a question of concern or of discussion over the past couple hundred years, especially with things like the Renaissance, with things like the Enlightenment, as well as other 19th, 20th century philosophers answering some foundational questions of ethics, trying to bring forward a framework, a theory, to try to understand and answer some of those basic questions. Now, I won't be going over some ethical theories that's been proposed. There's been a lot and many, and I am by no ways qualified in order to discuss many, if not any, accurately. And so I've done some reading in what other people have suggested, but I wanted to provide some thoughts and some framework to answer a very important question. What is the foundational ethical value to goodness? In other words, what is good? And I want to propose the answer of trustworthiness. Now, there's a few things how I see ethical, how I view ethics foundationally. One of the things that I see is that there seems to be an ideal or a goal or a telos, or there's a number of different ways that you could term it. But each one of them, it's built off of the foundation of what is human, what it is to be a person, and this goal ultimately is the ethical thing that we all compare things to. It is the good. It is the thing that is good. And we see this whenever people talk about anything, they make any judgment call. Implicitly, they are comparing this good, this ideal, to the current circumstances. And they're judging whether or not that means it's good or that means it's bad. How do I view what is this the good? What is this ideal? It seems to be foundationally based off of what humans are, which are evolutionarily derived primates, beings of people who have evolved over time, but with the added thing that we tend to be separated from our end goal in ways that other animals aren't. This is foundational to how I view humans, and I think in order to discuss what is ethical, we need to understand what it is to be human. And from what we can see from observation, it becomes quite clear that humans are a form of primate that have evolved in Africa over millions of years with certain qualities and abilities. However, it seems like starting at around the Neolithic Revolution, there was a major shift that separated humans from most of other animals, and we see this in the way that humans start interacting with each other. No longer are we primarily tribal. That doesn't mean that we could ever be tribal, but we're not primarily tribal. We start having different nations, societies, agriculture, religion, things of that manner. And because of this, it becomes quite clear that there was a major shift that happened in humanity. And I derive this to being a separation from the ideal. Every single animal, in the animal kingdom, there are biological niches. We observe this with how animals act, and we would expect for there to be a biological niche as well for humans. What's interesting, though, is that while we would expect for there to be a biological niche for humans, there does not seem to be one, at least not apparently. It's not apparent. And so what I find is foundational to the human experience is the separation from our biological niche, our telos, what our nature drives us to, and the state that we're actually in. This is the disconnection that we all experience. And I believe this experience probably happened at around the Neolithic Revolution, the start of it. And actually the Neolithic Revolution was probably the first consequence of this separation that happened in the psyche of all humans. And it began to spread, starting in the Middle East and going around the entire world eventually. Or eventually, now every single human being is affected by this shift in psyche, in consciousness. So there's the separation, and I would call this ideal, another term for it would be the moral imperative. It is what should be done, what is good. But then, what I found, and this is always the thing that complicates it, is that what necessarily you would think would be good to do does not actually end up always in every circumstance, which complicates things. Like, for example, stealing. The deontological theory points out that stealing is wrong and points to many examples and many reasons for why stealing should not happen. And fair enough, I think that's generally a good argument. But you'll have utilitarians, for example, who will counter that and will say, what if in order to maximize human happiness, you have to steal something? For example, what if a family needs to steal food in order to live? And this stealing would produce greater happiness for everyone in general. Maybe one person who they're stealing from, yes, their happiness is lessened, but in general, say, it increases. So maybe stealing isn't always that bad. So the question really becomes, well, hold on, is stealing bad? Well, according to how I see it, the ideal, the moral imperative is stealing is bad, but that doesn't mean that that's the reality. One of the foundational parts that comes out of the disconnect that we experience as humans, ethically and foundationally, is that we cannot live the ideal. And this is where I start getting into discussions of trust and trustworthiness. If there was a room of people, say there was a room of people, 5 people, and each one of them are some of the most trustworthy people you would ever meet. They're incredibly trustworthy. Because of so, they are naturally trusting of each other, and this is a natural reaction to trustworthiness, is people are trusting with each other. You would imagine living in this little group of people that life would actually be really, really great because everyone is doing the right thing. And what I found is that when discussions of goodness and morality come up, it seems like foundationally, what people are talking about is whether or not people are trustworthy or not. And if people are doing what's morally right, is just, are you being a trustworthy person? Not necessarily because trustworthiness doesn't necessarily mean that you're competent or that you're confident. Those are different abilities. You could be a very incompetent person, but you're very trustworthy, and people will honor that, seemingly. They may not find you like a good leader necessarily, but they would prefer you. People would much prefer a trustworthy yet incompetent person in their life than a competent but untrustworthy person. I think that's the key, right? You would much rather have a trustworthy person with any other quality, missing any other quality, than any other quality but not trustworthy. And that to me is the key. What I found is the defining thing that I've observed. And so back to the separation with the room of 5 people who are very trustworthy. Say then you introduce to this room of five people who are very trustworthy one person who is not trustworthy, who is untrustworthy, who is manipulative, for example. What you'll find is if you just have one singular person, even though the 5 others are very trustworthy and very morally good people, just one person and will act as an untrustworthy person, as one would expect an untrustworthy person to expect. Eventually, what will happen is that trust is broken. And once trust is broken, people can no longer be trusting in each other. And what happens is that whenever people can no longer trust each other, people start acting in untrustworthy ways as a form of defense against untrustworthy people. And so what happens is that one person who is untrustworthy can quite easily cause the whole group of people to lose their trustworthiness. And because of so, what is found is that now the ideal being of total trustworthiness, that seems to be the aim of human nature, is no longer achieved, is no longer possible. And another ethical foundation is that it is better as humanity to live yet suffer than to be extinct and no longer suffer. And I could go into that, but because of that assumption, that axiom, what is found is that what is observed is that people who devolve from their trustworthiness, it eventually does lead to extinction of that group. I mean, we can see it with people who, because they no longer trust each other. Numerous stories have been written about people who no longer trust each other, eventually go off, and I mean, a bunch of like murder mysteries have been written on this principle. The point being is that lack of trust in a community is a great way to lead to the extinction of that group. So with that, what's clear is a few different outcomes. Say one person in a room of trustworthy people will lead to the extinction of that group. So one person there and will lead to the extinction of that group. Okay, what if we have the opposite? What if we have 5 people who are untrustworthy and one person who is trustworthy? Say that one person who is trustworthy is doing everything that's morally right. The problem is that if you are the one person who is doing everything that's morally right in the room of people who are not doing things that are morally right, is that they could just kill you and nothing can stop them. I mean, sure, you may say, well, their untrustworthy behavior will eventually lead to their demise, and fair enough, but that's not going to matter if their demise happens after you die. So if they just kill you as an untrustworthy group, and then a year later their demise happens, well, that's great, but it just leads to everyone else's extinction, and so it doesn't lead to anything profitable. And so just being the trustworthy person and just ignoring the reality of the situation that you find yourself in isn't the answer. You have to be trustworthy, but also not put yourself in a situation where you don't survive past your enemy's demise. This is the reality, and this is why there is a disconnect. This is why it's so hard. It seems like it's so hard for human beings to actually do what's right. Even though it seems like we always understand what is right, it seems almost impossible for us to actually do what's right. The reason being is because the reality of the situation is that we can't necessarily always do what's right. Because if we just did what was morally right to ourselves, if we were just being a trustworthy person, people will abuse that. And even if you decided, I will still trust people, despite people abusing that trust, I mean, eventually it will lead to your demise. And oftentimes it's a lot easier to have the demise of one person than it is to have the demise of an entire group. Because in order for there to be the demise of the entire group, at least that includes the demise of multiple different people. So it's much easier for one person to experience demise before the group experiences demise. So we have now certain situations. If one person is untrustworthy, then extinction happens. If everyone except for one person is untrustworthy, then extinction happens. If everyone is just untrustworthy, then extinction happens. So then the answer is everyone has to be trustworthy. Always. Because if there's a moment where someone is not trustworthy, then the whole system can easily fall apart. And this is where you start seeing responses of authoritarianism in society, is once they realize we can't let anyone be untrustworthy ever. We can't let anyone do what's wrong ever, or lead to behaviors that would lead to people becoming untrustworthy. We can't ever allow that to happen, and so we must stop people using force, aka the government, in order to make sure that doesn't happen. This is where authoritarianism starts to become an answer. The problem with it, though, is that it becomes clear that oftentimes this response more often leads to tyranny than the actual solution. Because once you give one person force over others, unparalleled force over others, then while if they are a trustworthy person, that's great, but if the moment they're not, you basically have doomed your entire society. And that's not good. And that reason why that's not good is because it's not the fulfillment of our human natures as human beings, evolutionarily derived. So the answer becomes, okay, authoritarianism isn't the answer in order to ensure ethical standards. So what is? What can we do? Because otherwise, if humanity just does not do what's good, it will go extinct. if it does what's right, it will live to its fullest potential and will survive. And this is just observed looking at the animal kingdom and looking at human society over history. This is observed. So what do we do? How do we solve this problem? It seems like to me the answer to that is the slow building of trustworthiness. The reason being is because you can't force people to be trustworthy, because someone who's forced to be good isn't good. Someone who is required to be good by society isn't a good person. Someone is a good person whenever they, out of their own will, it chooses to be good. But someone who does not do that, they are at least not good. Maybe you can't say they're evil, but they're at least not good. And so it has to be a slow, voluntary, and basically everyone has to always be agreeing as we rise up in morality as a group. In order for the survival of humanity, it needs to be good. That is what is good. And that's become quite clear if you look at the world around us. Survival is good. And if that's the case, trustworthiness is needed in groups. And everyone needs to be trustworthy. Everyone needs to be trustworthy, every single member of the group. And they need to be trustworthy always. There can't be a moment of time. And once you combine the members and you combine time to it, what you get is perfection. And this is where it starts becoming even more impossible, because you can't require people, you can't expect for people to be perfect. You can't expect for people to be, for every single person to be good, and for each one of those people to be good always. And so now what you have is something that is almost impossible to ask of people. Now, how do I solve this problem? We might as well hope is my solution, because the alternative is extinction, is demise, is collapse. If we cannot achieve that good, if we cannot be good and stay good, then we are all extinct. Then death is the natural answer. In other words, if survival is good, then death is bad, is morally bad. Now, I could go a lot more into this, but to me, the only answer to human society and what's good, and how trustworthiness is the foundational moral good of society, then if we cannot achieve good, then we are dead, and we might as well already assume extinction. But since we are still alive, we might as well hope and act towards the good, the ideal, our telos, our biological niche as humans, because otherwise there's nothing else. Now, I could go a lot more into this subject. This video's already gone long, and I'm mostly rambling at this point. I could defend further assumptions and propositions that I've given, like, for example, that that survival is good. That's not necessarily, that's an assumption. I would need to defend that. I've just proposed that as part of this going into talks of trustworthiness and ethics and so on. But I could defend that if needed. But ultimately, it seems to me that life is good, extinction is bad, and this just seems to me to be the answer, that looking at the animal kingdom, looking at what we found when we've studied these things as a species. And so, yeah, that's my talk on trustworthiness. Those are my thoughts on general ethics. What is good, which brings the most life to most people. How does that function in society through the method of trustworthiness, through the function of trustworthiness, and what is morally bad, that which does not lead to the survival of the group and the flourishing of that group. Because I think there are two kind of ways of that. There's the survival, and then there's the flourishing. There's the prospering. Because those are two separate things, but they're both very important. But that could be discussed elsewhere. So yeah, those are just some of my thoughts on ethics, on what is good. And I hope you enjoyed that. I hope, at least, even if you don't agree with me, if you found that my thoughts are completely ridiculous, that it was at least intriguing, thought-provoking, and could kind of help you as you try to think about some of these important questions as well. So that was kind of the point of this video. So anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed that, and I'll see you guys for the next one. See you later.